Okay, so if you're happy to, Louise, then we'll make a start, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So thank you everybody for coming to today's talk. My name is Kate and I'm one of the co-conveners of the Oxford Police Discussion Group. And this is Louise. He's a DPhil candidate in criminology at the University of Oxford. His research is mainly focusing on the conditions of possibility for mass incarceration in Brazil in times of re-democratization and social inclusion. Louise, I don't know if you wanted to say a bit about yourself as well, if there's anything else you wanted to add, and then we can start with the talk.
All right, brilliant. I think we are good to go. Nothing else to add. I'll just try and share my screen here. Let me see if I'm able to do that. I'll ask you if you can see my screen. Of course, I think I won't be able to see you.
I can see it, yeah.
All right, brilliant. Okay. So is this the PowerPoint page that you see, or is it the?
So I can see your presentation, and that's all I can see is just the front page of that.
Okay. All right. Brilliant. So yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Kate, for inviting me to talk here. I would just like to highlight two main things before starting. And the first one is that this is not my current research topic. So I'm not focusing on these on my DPhil. I'm not a policing or police scholar and so on. But it is indeed somehow connected to my broader research topic, which is punishment. So hopefully by the end of my talk, you see how connected both these topics could be or are. And this is also to say that this will be a bit more descriptive, mainly at the very beginning of my talk, at the first half of my talk. And my aims are to first introduce this topic to you, also shed light into a peripheral reality, and give you information on what I consider one of the most important issues currently in Brazil. And the second thing is, I don't know if you may have realized at this point, but my eyes are a bit red, my nose a bit blocked. So I've got this relatively severe hay fever. So I'm under medication, which causes drowsiness. So if I'm a bit slow, feel free just to give me a shout if I'm running out of my time, okay? And yeah, all right. So to start, just to give you a brief outline of my talk, I'll first talk about letting die, which is a passive instance of or the Brazilian state before homicides and before killings in Brazil. I'll be then talking about, numbers of homicide rates, who is killed, the state responses to homicide. I think there's someone in the waiting, in the lab waiting to come. I don't know if I should be the one to accept them. Can you see that, Kate? Just got a message here.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, I'll let them in. No worries.
Okay, all right, brilliant. Then on the second part of my talk, I'll be talking about killing, which in turn is the active instance in which the Brazilian state kills its very people. So again, we'll talk about some numbers of police deadly action. I'll talk about the profile of those being killed by the police, and then compare and put this in comparison, not only with people who die from general homicides in Brazil, but also in terms of the general population. Then I'll show how this is being transformed in something legal or a legitimated mechanism, even though it's not there by the book, but it is in fact. And then I'll conclude my presentation just to try to make sense of this duality and also highlighting some contradictions, some complexities and challenges that emerge from this context. So when I talk about letting die, as I said, this is a passive instance of the Brazilian state before homicides. Brazil has a very high homicide level. So in absolute numbers, it is nearly 6,000 homicides per year since 2012. But of course, Brazil is also a very populous country, so we should put that in a proportional perspective. And this is why we use homicide rates. So here we can see that nowadays homicide rates in Brazil are just over 30. And if we take the 80s by way of comparison, we'll see that this has doubled in this period. So from the 80s to nowadays. And again, if I just say that, okay, the homicide rate in Brazil is just over 30, we can't have the full picture. So it's important to compare this with all the countries, all the regions. If we take the world average one, we'll see that the Brazilian homicide rate is just over 5 times higher than that. And Brazil has also a higher homicide rate, even when we compare to countries which you probably thought would have higher rates, such as Mexico and Colombia, but also some broader regions such as Central America, South America. And among the examples here, the only country which has a higher level of homicide, a higher homicide rate, is South Africa. Western countries such as the UK will have a rate of homicide of 1, which means Brazilian homicide rate is like 30 times higher than in so-called Western democracies or Western countries. And who's killed in Brazil? I here start to frame these victims as killable lives, and you see why. They have a very clear profile, so they are young black men. Half of them are aged between 15 and 29. 3 out of 4 are black, and over 90% are men. So we have here a clear profile. But there's also another feature which is very important when we consider this homicide, these killings, and this has to do with territorialization. So if we take Brazil as a whole country, we'll have the concentration of these deaths, of these killings, in poorer regions. So northeast and Midwest homicide rates will be over 35. And in comparison, the richer parts of Brazil, southeast and south, have rates of homicide under 25. So there's a gap here of over 10, which is quite considerable if we consider Brazil as, a big, large country. But also when we take these relatively richer parts of Brazil, like southeast and south, so São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, we'll see another feature here, which also has to do with territorialization. So the concentration of these deaths, of these homicides, in metropolitan areas and mainly or mostly in favelas. So here, this could be considered a fourth element. So they are not only young black men, but they are also poor. So poor, marginalized people are the victims of homicide in Brazil. And what does the Brazilian state do as a consequence of that? So what are the state responses to these high levels of homicides? I here start to compare the representation of homicide in Brazilian prison population. So back in the 80s, the proportion or the representation of homicides, people convicted for homicide in Brazil, would be something about 20%. And nowadays, we see that the homicide rate has doubled, and yet the proportion of people imprisoned based on homicide has just been reduced by the half. If we take this in isolation, if we just take this issue isolated, it won't tell us much, right? Because all the sorts of crimes have also increased in Brazil. So drug trafficking, robbery, and so on. But if we take the homicide elucidation rate, we can have a better idea of this, of the state responses to that. So homicide elucidation rate means the percentage of police inquiries which were able to end up in a charge. So a charge, someone has been considered the homicide perpetrator, and then the prosecution charged them as this possible homicide perpetrator, which is to say they are not necessarily the homicide perpetrator, but they are at first glance considered that. So in countries such as Germany and Japan, also UK and Canada, this is near 100%. In the US, this is already a bit slower, so 65%. In Argentina, it is about 50%. Of course, these countries don't have such a high level of homicide as Brazil. But when we look at the percentage, the homicide elucidation rate in Brazil, we can be a bit surprised. So it varies between 5 and 8%, which means that just between 5 and 8 cases out of 100, the police is able to come up with a possible homicide perpetrator. So in at least 92 cases out of 100, they not even know who could be considered guilty, and the charge and the police inquiry is just dropped. So letting die is the passive domain, is the passive instance of the Brazilian state before killings. And there's here two aspects. So first we have the killable lives. They are unprotected, they don't have their lives protected. There's nothing from the Brazilian state to make sure these people can live. They're simply left to die. And on the other hand, once these homicides happen, so once they are already committed, this is just a state inertia. So these homicides aren't investigated, and consequently they aren't punished. So tens of thousands of poor, black and marginalized people are simply left to die annually in Brazil. But we then have the action of killing. So this now we move to the active instance of the Brazilian state before killings. So I'm here analyzing the police deadly action. Well, we've just seen that Brazil is a high crime society, right? So a violent country with high rates of homicide. So people could think, okay, so it is expected to also have a high number or a high percentage of police killings in the country, right? Well, we will see if that's the case or not. In absolute numbers, since 2018, the number of people who were killed by the police is over 6,000. So more than 6,000 people being killed by Brazilian police every year. And we can see there's an increase here in a short period of time. But how can we measure if there's any sort of excess, or if this is just proportional to the homicides in Brazil and so on? So this is called Paul Chevigny, who indicates these three possible measurements. And the first one is the proportion or the relation between civilians killed and civilians wanted by the police. Unfortunately, there's no data on that for the whole Brazilian country, but we do have this for São Paulo state. And in bold, we'll see the higher numbers. So we are here comparing people killed and wanted by the police in a period of 10 years. Just only in 2 of these years, there were more people wanted than killed by the police. So people are more often killed than wanted. And this is a good indication that there is some sort of excess here. And when we look at the second possible measurement, we will have the same conclusion. So here we're considering the relation between police killed by civilians and civilians killed by the police. It could give us an idea of whether or not this is just a consequence of, you know, being in settings of conflict and so on. But when we have 70 civilians killed by the police to every policeman killed on duty, we say, well, this may be a bit disproportionate, right? So it doesn't look like just a consequence of a settings of conflict. And then in the end we can have a look at the representation of police lethality in the totality of homicides in the country. And in Brazil, this is over 13, which is a relatively high percentage. So this scholar, Paul Chevigny, he talks about something about 5%, maybe a bit more, depending on, you know, the particularities of the country. And then, of course, as I said, there's the sorts of differences, regional differences in Brazil. If we take a look at the reality in Rio de Janeiro, we'll see that the representation of police lethality is over 30%. So 3 people who are killed in Rio de Janeiro out of every 10 people killed, they were killed by the police, which is absolutely high. And who is killed by the police? I'm here comparing 4 groups of people, which are actually just 2 groups of people. So the gray bars are the general population, and the light blue are those victims of police lethality. We can see this pattern taking place again. So male, young adults, and black. And if we consider this yellow and brown or red bars too, which are the profile of victims of homicide and the profile of victims being incarcerated in the country, we will see that they are very close to each other. So victims of police lethality, victims of homicide, and incarcerated people, they have a very similar profile. But when they are compared to the general population, we will see a shocking disproportionality, right? So you can take a look here. You probably have done already, and I won't take longer. But yeah, there's a high disproportionality between these profiles. And the thing is, it is important to consider that the Brazilian murderous phase, or the Brazilian active stance before killings, does not end with the trigger pulled. So after police kill people, there's a whole legal process that will frame, that will transform these killings into lawful killings. So there's a process to legalize or to legitimize police lethality as an accepted or as a legal mechanism. And this is called resistance reports. It comes from the resistance reports, which is basically the police inquiries of cases in which police kill someone, and at the very beginning, the policemen themselves, they claim those killings, and they just argue these killings were in self-defense. So just to sum up what these resistance reports are, the result of them, is that policemen who kill aren't punished at all, and they are actually even they are barely investigated. So there's no investigation of these deaths, even though they claim those killings at the very beginning. So if first we saw that people aren't punished when they commit homicide, but they weren't punished because nobody know who committed those crimes. Here we have a different context, right? The homicide perpetrators, they claim these killings at the very beginning. And what happens is that the police inquiries are dropped before any charge is filed. If by chance the file is charged because maybe there was media it was, it reached a place in media news, or somebody eventually filmed or recorded that action, and the charges filed. It doesn't matter because they aren't punished anyway. Because again, they claim that either they killed someone who was committing a crime, or someone who was in a very dangerous place, which are favelas. So they argue that the person who was killed, if they aren't criminals, if they can't prove that person had any sort of relation with a criminal past or some criminal activities, they will say, okay, but that region is very dangerous. It's known by being controlled by gangs. It is known by criminal activities such as drug trafficking. So the person was in the wrong place, and we can't do anything. We were just walking, and that happened. So that's why I say that this process investigates the dead and all the deaths. So they will try and frame the people who are killed as criminals. They will try and build that narrative to argue people who were killed, they were criminals, and they do some sort of investigation just to prove it and not to understand what happened in the crime scene. So I then claim that this is what we have as the officialized death penalty in Brazil, even though it's not an official death penalty by the book. It is what we have, the Brazilian form of enforcing death penalty in our reality, so in practice. But I won't have time to further develop this. We can talk about this in the Q&A maybe. So yeah, here is the active domain, where police action generates these killings. It's actually police deadly action, but it is not all. There's also this legal process, this legal action that will frame these killings as lawful, and will allow police killings to be reproduced again and again. So whereas Brazilian state lets some people, lets tens of thousands of marginalized people to die every year, it also actively kills all the thousands of marginalized people. And how can we make sense of this duality? So if this is not just cause and consequence, if the high numbers of police lethality is not a consequence of the country being, high in crime, having high homicide rates, how can we understand this? And I argue that we shouldn't understand this as, two opposite or two, as I said, cause and consequence, but actually two complementary parts. They are part of the same thing. And the idea of necropolitics by Benbe is very helpful for us to make sense of this. And by necropolitics, Benbe means the subjugation of life to the power of death. So the author, the scholar, he starts to discuss questions or issues on sovereignty, but he moves away from, the mainstream abstract idea of democratic consensus achieved through communicative processes, and he argues that sovereignty is actually the power and the capacity to dictate who's able to live and who must die. And we can clearly see this happening in the Brazilian society. And another thing that the Benbe does is to compare or to evaluate the changes of the exercise of the sovereign rights skill back in colonial times and in contemporary societies, so in modern states. And we could do the same, taking the Brazilian context in reference. So if in the past the sovereign rights skill wasn't subject to legal or any legal or institutional rules because, the empire, the colonizers were the very law, were the very power there. In contemporary times, we kind of also have this happening in Brazil. So where there's this state inertia before these killings. So when these marginalized people are being killed, there's no legal or institutional rule to either prevent or punish these actions. But There's also these killings taking place within the realm of legality through the police apparatus and some legal arrangements, as I just said. And also, if in the past there was the sort of external dimension, so killings in disputed and recently occupied territories, killing the order, killing the colonized, nowadays we have maybe an internal dimension. So these killings are taking place within the own borders of the state. In undisputed, this may be a bit disputable, but let's put it this way, and in disputed territories, and mainly against its own citizens. So if we use these legal terms, we will find a difference between old times and nowadays, in contemporary times. But if we look at the reality, there are, of course, differences, but also some similarities. It is always the order who's being killed. And if in the past they weren't considered citizens, nowadays they are, at least legally. So this also takes place in the modern state and within the very state, the borders of the very state. So we can clearly see the centrality of necropolitics in the governance of Brazilian society. So producing and reproducing social order in the country, and dominant relations and social relations in more broadly speaking. And yeah, as I said, I'm not a policing scholar. And here I start to show you how this can be connected to punishment and society scholarship, for example. And again, there are some contradictions, complexities, and challenges emerging from this context, from this duality of killing and letting die. And first, if we consider some challenges for knowledge production, I here mention some of them. So if we're measuring punitiveness, okay, in punishment and society, rates of imprisonment has been used as an indicative of a country's punitiveness, but I'm not that sure how accurate it is. So if we take this reality in Brazil, we could have, on the one hand, a state that kills its people rather than arrest or imprison them, and this being unnoticed by the mere analysis of imprisonment. And on the other hand, a crime as serious as homicide could be going unpunished. But this doesn't represent a case of tolerant as an opposite of punitive penal system. Rather, couldn't we also say that this non-punitive, of course, in this given context, can also mean another level of state punitiveness or violence too? And yeah, if we move and try to understand some possible relations between punishment and society scholarship and police killings, we would ask, okay, but why doesn't punishment and society scholarship address issues on police killings? Is it maybe because this is a more southern problem rather than something happening in global north, where issues on police are better defined as police brutality rather than police lethality, as it could be framed in global south? And I'm here genuinely asking. I'm not saying I'm not putting in evaluation this. I'm genuinely asking that question. And if we take, as I put, some police killings as form of punishment, can we actually do that? Is it accurate to say that? So can police killings be indeed understood as a form of punishment? And in this case, in the Brazilian case, there is the particularity of the settings in which there is also the judicial activity systematically considering them as a lawful activity. And if yes, does this mean contemporary punishment has actually escaped a trend of more subtle and hidden punishment that we thought in the past that it will become nowadays, like in present times? And also, how can we make sense of the state inertia before high homicide rates? In this context, can a state be considered more punitive exactly by not punishing? Is it possible to say that? And finally, how misleading can the analysis of punitiveness limited to incarceration rates be, as I asked before? I don't know, but maybe this poses some sort of methodological implications or maybe an invisibility for the development of comparative studies, or we should think other ways to do that. I don't know. And then if we consider something beyond the knowledge production, but also there are also questions for political praxis. So we are back in a traditional discussion between left realism and abolitionism. So, as long highlighted by left realist criminologists, marginalized communities are the ones who most suffer from crime and violence. They are the most victimized people in relation to crime, widely known as the most serious one, which is homicide. And it follows from this that they are the very ones who most need protection from the state, right? But at the same time, abolitionists are right when they argue police and the state penal apparatus produce more harm than ensure security for vulnerable and marginalized people. So poor, black, and marginalized young men are those who most suffer from the police intervention too. So they are the victims of police lethal action, which, as I mentioned earlier, does not necessarily take place in contexts where policemen have their lives threatened. So yeah, I'd say that they suffer both from the lack, but also the presence of the police. So the biggest question would be, what is it to be done then? And I think we could discuss this after in the Q&A, because of course we can think of those issues on defund the police and so on. But mainly, if we think in terms of protection, right? If we think in police as protecting vulnerable people, we could think, okay, maybe there are alternatives which aren't necessarily through the police. But what about the lack of investigation of those homicides? How could we deal with that if there's no available police to investigate and to find out what happened and so on? So that's a bit tricky, and maybe we could discuss this in the Q&A. So just to conclude, we have indeed this passive instance of the Brazilian state before killings. So on the one hand, the police does not protect marginalized lives, but on the other hand, in an active way, they kill marginalized lives too. And if in a passive instance, they don't investigate murders, again, of marginalized deaths, they actively investigate the marginalized dead. So they investigate those who were killed by the police to make them guilty for their very killings. And finally, in a passive instance, people are not held accountable for killing. So this may also be something that allows the reproduction of those killings. So the Brazilian state simply doesn't do anything to prevent these killings to be reproduced. But on the other hand, by framing police killings as lawful, they are holding accountable those people who are killed by the police. So they held accountable the dead. And again, here we can see the centrality of necropolitics in the governance of Brazilian society, in the production and reproduction of social order in the country. That's basically all. I don't know if I've gone over my time. If I've gone, sorry. But yeah, we can discuss whatever you want now. Have I stopped sharing my screen?
Right, yes, I can just see you, and I can just see Ian now.
Okay, brilliant.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that talk. It was really, for somebody who studies British policing, like, it's definitely been useful for me to see how policing operates, or kind of what issues there are with policing outside of the UK. So thank you, because that was really interesting. What I'd like to do now is open it up for Q&A.